years ago. Student strike of 60. This history and what I'm discuss you the background and the context, and then I'm going to introduce some current diversity is that the United States pretty horrible record of dealing with minorities, immigrants, etc. I've listed just a few things that kind of symbolize some of the real horrible problems that this country has. Slavery, of course, and then the history of the post-slavery time, Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws, and lynchings. I mean, something like more than 4,000 African Americans in the country have been lynched as a result of racial attacks. So I mean, that's a horrible history. But the Indian Removal Act, this country by policy, Native Americans horribly, driven them off their lands, and that certainly is part of this picture. Asian Americans certainly have not been excluded from this history of bias. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese American internment. My parents were interned during World War II. The Zoot riots, Mexican Americans. One of the first people who lived in the United States, and their territories were taken over by the United States. The famous Zoot riots in Los Angeles, when sailors, U.S. sailors, simply started attacking Mexican Americans in the streets, and they became known as the Zoot riots because at that time this particular style of suit was fashionable, and Mexican Americans were wearing that. And then I skipped over redlining. We've had this history of segregation in housing, and also, of course, education and other things that have really severely impacted people of color. At the same time, and this is kind of the context of the 68 strikes, as alluded to in the film, we had a lot of social upheaval, people reacting to this. And so the civil rights movement, of course, the women's movement, across the bay, the free speech movement at UC Berkeley, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the gay liberation movement, touched off by a violent police riot against gays and lesbians in New York, and then the Third World Liberation Movement, which was really what the San Francisco State strike was a part of, a much larger coalition of students of color coming together, looking for equity in education. So all of this was going on at this time. So quite a turbulent period in U.S. history. Then we move into, and this is where it starts to get into journalism, is what became known as the hot summers of the 60s, when in different parts of the country, rioting or racial violence broke out in different cities, where African American communities were really just frustrated and angered by the situation that they were living in. So this is from the Watts riots in Los Angeles of 1965. The Detroit riot of 67 was particularly has become symbolic of this whole situation. And if you live in Detroit, you will constantly hear this debate. Was this really a riot? or was this a rebellion? And that's the kind of different perspectives that people put onto it. So we were really, in that time period, this was a pretty frightening time when everything was kind of coming to a head of all kinds. So this is how we get to the Kerner Commission. The reporting at that time, and if we had a little more time, we could show you vintage television coverage of the riots. But predictably, news coverage treated the people who were protesting or rioting as anything from mobs to looters. And their concerns were really not well reported. President Johnson, to his credit, wanted to find out why are we having riots in Los Angeles, Detroit, Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, etc. I mean, just all across the country. So he appointed this commission to investigate two questions, really. What were the root causes of these riots? Why are African American communities angry? And secondly, to what extent has news media coverage of the riots or the African American communities contributed to the discontent in this country? So this became a landmark study, 1968, 50 years ago. What I'm hoping that we can persuade you is that this study and the conclusions resonate even today, particularly given the political situation that we're experiencing now. So a couple quick things. The commission determined that the riots were not really black-white conflicts. These were African Americans kind of reacting to what they saw as kind of white institutions controlling their lives and keeping them tamped down. The riots were not as bad as you might have thought from the press coverage, actually fairly minor. Two were particularly bad, Detroit and New York. And they really were not attacking, blacks were not really attacking whites so much as attacking white institutions. And in fact, when you look at those who were killed, the vast majority were blacks. And resulted from deaths caused by their dealings with the authorities. What the Kerner Commission then found, and this was quite a massive study, is that really there were very legitimate reasons for this discontent within the African American community. And they listed 12 grievances. I've listed them all here. The 1, 2, and 3 were considered police abuse, overuse of police authority in black communities, unemployment, lack of jobs, inadequate housing. You can go down this list, it's right here, and I've got a little handout here that's got them listed as well. But I think you can see that these grievances, as they were called, resonate today with many of the kinds of situations that we are dealing with. Bless you. The second question. Were the U.S. news media, were reporters and journalists and newspapers and television stations, were they culpable in any way to the situation? On the good side, there were some good things. The Kerner Commission really did examine news coverage of that time period, and they found that for the most part, journalists were fairly responsible, did not sensationalize. They did exaggerate the extent of the damage, but that they did occasionally stage events. They asked protesters to do things for their television cameras, and that their headlines were often exaggerated, and that they often reported rumors.
Can I just apologize?
Yep.
We have the time wrong, so we're having
Okay. Come on in.
Hi.
Hi. Take a seat, because we're trying to move on here. Hi. Hi. Good to see friendly faces. But the Kerner Commission also was really critical of the news media's general failure to cover the African American community, and they said that this was really a real mistake on the part of journalists. If you go back into journalism history, you would not be surprised by this finding, because from the very start of the beginnings of newspapers in the colonial period in the United States, the bias against blacks and Native Americans, for example, later the Chinese immigrants, was quite apparent. The Kerner Commission found that reporters rarely actually talked to people in the black community, but mostly resorted to the use of official sources. This is a long-standing complaint about journalists, that we don't go into the community and talk to people. When I showed you that Los Angeles Times page 1 of the Watts riots, at that time, believe it or not, the Los Angeles Times did not have a single black reporter. And they sent, I believe it was a mailroom clerk, an African-American mailroom clerk in to cover the riots. The news media do not report on the issues that are relevant to the black community. They have simply ignored the racial problems, and few newspapers, television stations, radio stations had, at that time, black or any other journalists of color on their staff. And this is something that Bruce will be. This statement in the report became kind of the most important conclusion, or the most well-remembered conclusion. The media report and write from the standpoint of a white man's world. Okay. African Americans of that time period to call newspapers and television stations, the white press, because they simply the ills of the ghetto, the life there, the Negroes' burning sense of grievance are seldom conveyed. I have to say that while this was a very important report, it actually fell flat in the immediate, when it was immediately released. President Johnson did not embrace the report, nor did journalists. Most journalists ignored it, and it took a while for like this sink in. Eventually, what we now think of as the diversity movement in journalism started to take hold. Some newspaper editors, some television news directors, and others, some professional organizations started to develop programs designed to recruit and train people of color into the profession. Schools like Columbia, Berkeley, Missouri, San Francisco State started special programs designed to address diversity issues in the curriculum. A group many of us know as the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education started both a training program and something that's called the Fault Lines program. And later, as journalists of color began to organize themselves, National Association of Black Journalists, Asian American Journalists, National Association of Hispanic Journalists, Native American Journalists Association, later Journalism and Women's Symposium, the Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association, all started to organize because they knew that they needed to combine their forces as individual journalists into a larger coalition. And one of the most exciting kind of movements was the unity journalism movement, in which journalists of all colors came together to push an agenda for diversity and to pressure newspapers, television, and radio stations to hire more, to do better in covering their communities. San Francisco State was the first to start on San Francisco State called the Center for Journalism. I'm a former Karina is a was very much involved in that. And so a lot of things got started as a result of the Kerner report. I'm now to turn it over to Bruce, who's been looking into what's happened since.
Great, thank you, John. And this button is that button. Okay, they say learn the technology first. Well, thank you and good morning. You know, I'm afraid I was a little late this morning, so I'm still learning the lay of the land. A lot of people just walked in. Are you the journalism students? Okay, so
So I thought it was starting in
that's fine.
There was a
Yeah.
time mix-up.
Okay, that's all right. How many are journalism students here? Okay, good, because that's what this was about. So, well, thank you again. You know, as Professor Fudabiki just explained, the Kerner Commission, you know, occurred at a time of great social unrest and political awakening, and particularly noted the problem with the media. So, John and I, when we thought, how can we make history relevant, we wanted to accomplish two things. One, give you a little sense of the history, because as your professors and your teachers have always told you, there's nothing necessarily new under the sun. And when you begin to realize this is part of a continuum, it both can help inform you in terms of how you're going to manage today, and it can help give you, we hope, a healthy perspective of why things are. And we also specifically thought about the fact that some of you may have already been interns in newsrooms, or if you're pursuing this seriously, will be doing that. Because as we spoke more, and John asked me to look into an update, I got really depressed because I said, wait a minute, this is all happening 50 years ago, and why am I reading and looking at statistics and hearing phrases that, my God, could be ripped from the headlines that we have today? And the other part, too, is, and I thought you just started to get involved into it in that last discussion when the individual asked, what were the headlines during the San Francisco strike? Because you as journalists and journalist students are going to find yourself in this unique position of both being involved, but being a truth teller. I mean, I think someone even suggested there, you know, how much of your own beliefs and values are going to be able to come to play in describing and in reporting and being a witness to history on some very, very troubling and intense conflicts. So that's what we hope you'll take away from the fact that, as you saw in the film, these are not new issues necessarily, and the Kerner Commission itself was pretty dramatic. So one of the things, as John just pointed out, is about the Kerner Commission that you noted, you know, is that the main failure of the media that summer was the totality of its coverage, that it was not representative as it should have been to be accurate. Now let's think about those words for a minute. As representative as it should have been to be accurate. As you're probably learning in your journalism courses, accuracy is one of the fundamental tenets of why you become a journalist, to provide an accurate version and truth of what is occurring. And the sense of the Kerner Commission was that without representation, without people with these different perspectives, how can you be accurate? And again, this was 50 years ago they were talking about this, which is kind of incredible, because we often use this term diversity. It's become a little, I don't want to say it's become a throwaway line, but you know, there is a little bit, I know for those of us who have been here a while, diversity fatigued. This notion is diversity just one of those political correct point checks you have to play out some of your card. But there was actually a belief, you know, after the Kerner Commission and when these movements started happening, that if we just got more people in the room, into these white newsrooms, different perspectives would occur, different attitudes would happen, and we'd get a closer version of the truth. Because the lessons of the Kerner Commission was that you can't, the ills that prevent a just society can't happen if you don't have different storytellers, if you don't have perspectives. And so this is what diversity ultimately means at that time. Again, for journalists, you not only have to, but we have to exercise a standard higher than getting it right. I mean, journalists is it's not always as accurate, and yet media so important in a day of false news and a daily coverage ethics. Keep in mind, too, and this is all a lead up to I have good news and I have bad news. The bad news is that it's still bad. Good news, and we'll talk a little bit more about what changes are coming ahead and which you're going to be part of. This is all happening today, a few years ago, when media, was a lot stronger. During the Kerner Commission, people did believe when they that there were guns, black people with guns, and get us just around the corner. Today, even if you are accurate, even if you are reporting truth, doesn't trust much. And part of that reason is they look at you, they look at media and say, well, first of all, I don't see my representation there. And it's not just people of color. One of the great sins of the 2016 election was white rural America was completely missed. This is one of the reasons the polls were off as the reporting missed. There are large segments of the population that could not find their stories in media. And this, again, 50 years ago, we began to look. So, how bad was it? Well, as I said, the theory was at the time, the first step is let's get some attention into the newsroom. And the commission noted that at the time, 5% of the people employed, 5% editorial jobs in the United States were, quote, Negroes, managerial positions. You should remember this line from 50 years ago, because I'm going to bring it later. We can't find qualified Negroes. That was the reason, one reason given at the time that, well, what was it in the film? Were all you here for the film, or some of you here for the film? When Harry Edwards, the sociologist, was explaining to the professor that, I'm a doctorate student here at Cornell, and he says, well, can you read? Can you write? I mean, this was not atypical of its time. In fact, they noted 50 years ago, there's no Negroes in positions of editorial responsibility, and there was only one Negro with actually the column. That was Carl Rowan. Yeah, this was your America. Now, 50 years ago, 1968, for many of you in the room, it's your grandparents, right? They were born about then. Your parents might not have even been born yet, right? So, to be honest, as said, there was a lot of lack and its history of what. But actually, after the Kerner Commission came out, as you saw, there was some progress. A new mindset came in, we have to do something about this. And so newspapers began to hire backs as columnists, reporters, and editors, and many in time renowned. A quick aside, the Oakland Tribune, which is no longer, eBay Tribune, and there was a mention of the Maynard Institute, Robert Maynard and his wife, Nancy Hicks, two of the prominent African Americans who were hired subsequently after the New York Times and the Washington Post, helping change things. And also, progress is measured by the notion of diversity itself, social, sexual orientation, gender, income equality, all become part of the discussion. So I wanted this another document that was as way for journalists, the Kerner Commission. As Joe pointed out, they were a little late. But 10 years after the Kerner Commission, the Association, the American Society of Newsreaders, said, we should do something. And this is a photograph. It's actually 1963 of these are the Associated News Society newspaper editors and their wives. That's the caption. With then President Johnson at a press conference. So again, this is what the world kind of looked like at the time 10 years later. So in 1978, this is 1978 now, we're jumping ahead 10 years. And keep in mind that newspapers were still the dominant news industry. They decided we need to do something about this, and they challenged the news industry to achieve racial parity by year 2000. And again, it became an annual census to talk about how well we're doing, the report card. At the time, just like paper editors in America, minorities need to be urgently rekindled, and partly it's the right thing to do. But they also recognize the demographics of the country were changing. Again, this is 1978, and if you're following this today, you'll probably see a similar notion that the country itself was getting browner and blacker, and therefore, who are our customers going to be? So the right thing, but they also said, you know, for looking ones, who's going to be reading us, who's going to be listening to us? There should be an annual accounting by the American Society of Newspapers on how we're getting folks into there. There should be an emphasis on training and getting people into those positions. Small newspapers, in particular, should be encouraged to add. So, with great fanfare, and they fixed this annual survey. If you go into the library school and type term university, you'll get this sad litany of every year the ASNEs pointing out that there's been progress, but not much. In recent years, it's even gotten so bad that the ASNE this year had to extend the deadline for new organizations to send in their survey results because only 12% bothered to do so. So not only is there this crisis of not meeting its achievement, but it seems to have fallen off the radar at a time what was being perceived at that time. The Journalism Review, which just put the entire on this very getting this out was that 17% of U.S. newsrooms is not white. Do the math. Can somebody do the math for me? What percentage is white? And what's wrong with it being all white again? As we talked about, you can't tell everyone's story when you don't have everyone in the room. So just very quickly, the years of failure. This is one patch, 2015. Newsroom representation has stayed under for over 12 years there, beyond. This line is TV news. News has come into fore and moved up fairly quickly compared to the legacy media. Newspapers, NEO has been always under 10. This is the environment you may be facing when you get into newsrooms. I talked about the fact that this last election, how many stories were missed about black and brown and yellow communities, white rural America. This is the makeup of the reporting teams. The New York Times group, 10% African Americans. Today, 83%, 6%, 11%. The Washington Post, 69%. Non-whites, they put together 31%. PR, 68%, with 16 and 16. I will give these news organizations credit because, again, when studying the Columbia Journalism Review, those numbers, most newsrooms in America. I find this a bit ironic. A point to make later, who we as journalists love, seem to have realized that diversity is not only the right thing to do, but business. So what went wrong? What went wrong? As we discussed, there was not a priority among news organizations. Journalists themselves on a pedestal that doing God's work for the public. was a hostile backlash, quite frankly, in your days, and even still today, among staff who said, you're imposing on my power base, you're taking my assignment away from me. There's something called unconscious bias, which I believe John and others taught here at SF State, while even those that are well-intended may be carrying perceptions through that color, no pun intended, how they treat you or what they view or how you can behave. Journalists of color who now do get into newsrooms find themselves alone. They find themselves not supported. Newsrooms are terrible places for training and supporting all of its people. So an environment where maybe you have a different perspective or a different idea, and there's no support in that newsroom. And most people find themselves tasked with other burdens. Since you're the only one in the room, you have to be the one that's going to represent the whole community. How am I doing? Okay. So let me mention that. Those are the kind of statistics and aspects of that. So again, we talk about what failed, and I thought this was so well said by Mona Shilabi, writing in this issue of the Columbia Journalist Review. I'm just going to give you those words. The structural forces that contribute to this problem are, quite frankly, well known, and they reflect how race and privilege intersect. The main treatments into journalism, unpaid internships, journalism schools tend to favor people who can afford them. I think one of the exceptions where I taught here about a long time ago. About San Francisco State students, because I taught at some other places. This is where I was working. I said, my God, these are hardworking students who may have a day job, who are here because they see something that drives them with passion and they want to make it happen. I had an 8 a.m. class. They were there. They had ideas. It was great. But not all journalism schools are like that. A lot of them are, quite frankly, like Cornell and privileged. Internships, until recently, were unpaid. My final years were at KQED as news director. That's one of the things. By offering paid internships, the diversity of our internship pool changed 80%. Because after all, who can afford to give a summer up unless you get trust fund or someone's buying you? Hires are made through existing networks in which people tend to affiliate and emphasize with themselves. So during my study, as John mentioned, in the Maynard Institute, I was talking to the editor of a prominent newspaper in Houston, and I said, "You don't post the jobs?" He says, "No." The editor calls the phone up, calls up good old John from his college days of football and journalism, and says, "Hey, we got an opening, John. Why don't you come on down?" This was today, and again, I'm sort of shocked. In this day and age of at least paying lip service to diversity, you would think a major newspaper in a state like Texas, would be having some programs in place. When people of color manage to get hired, there's no formal mentorship. They're essentially left to go in there on your own. And look, you all know it's a scary situation. What if you're going on and you have that extra burden of the color of your skin or the religious background or whatever it is? And when job cuts happen, and they've been happening, but they're going to get better, the first to go are often those in journalists. There's a good by Pauline, who actually studied the New York Times since the 1960s. I like the New York Times. I appreciate the hardworking journalism they're doing, but they need to be called out. They have a very poor diversity program, and they didn't return my phone calls, so I take it personally as well. No, that last part wasn't true. But it was interesting in the study that progress did happen when the editors and the publishers, in other words, the people on top, prioritized this and implemented specific initiatives, such as affirmative action committees or one-on-one hiring. One-on-one hiring means I hire you, a white male, I gotta hire something that's not a white male. There's a new version of that going around now. And it's borrowed from sports. Does anyone know this? The Rooney Clause. You know what the Rooney Clause is? Yes.
I think it's you at least one candidate the position that anyone of color.
Right. Get that pool going. This is not hiring. That was just making sure you, at least you would interview others. But during his study found out that even with those programs in place, there was bitterness from white editors who worked to undercut diversity efforts, partly by refusing to mentor someone. And there's others who would start talking about you behind your back, you know you're hired because you're an affirmative action hire. It's very hard for white men in the journalism world to relinquish the power that they've held, one writer told me recently. And then I mentioned to you about unconscious bias, which is a whole program called Fault Lines. But very, very quickly, again, even your best intents, you've only associated in a certain way. So editors are great about what they want in an ideal journalist. Maybe you've had these interviews. You've got to be goal-driven. You got to be aggressive. And you got to be ready to compete with the big boys. Now, those are qualities. They are. But is this male stereotype all there is? What about being persistent? What about being good at developing trust? What about just knowing things from a different perspective? I'm sure you're going to hear this story sometime, or your life experience more than one time in my whole career. In 2005, I'm in the newsroom, and I called from somebody not in the newsroom, somebody from another part of the newspaper. And they said, Luther Vandross just died. Now, I realize there's an age thing here, so the name might not resonate. Did we already get that photo? Nope, the wrong thing. No. At the time in 2007, this was one of the top Grammy Billboard artists in the country. Yet in a world where black and white were separate, 3 people in that newsroom who took the call said, "Who's Luther Vandross?" Yeah, I'm sure if Paul McCartney responded. That was the type of representation has been done. So as I mentioned, Mark's survey with I interviewed 14 news organizations, newspapers, televisions, radio stations, and digital sites. The number one issue they said was preventing them from being more diverse qualified candidates. Now, what was the phrase I asked you to remember? I couldn't find it. Well, still this kind of thing. Well, it can't come in. And once I get, well, you're not going to keep anyone. You kind of an organizational structure function. I talk about in interviewing journalists in newsrooms today, journalists of color, the kind of burden they feel being the only one in the room. So one reporter said, I was asked specifically, hey, do you have a black years old who can long-form narrative? Recruitment aspect. And is this all of our problems? Every one of us as journalists should be going beyond the people you know to develop your sources. There's no reason a journalist in the newsroom has to know about issues. It's got to be a shared experience in our newsrooms. So, with these kind of problems, is there any silver lining? I mentioned there's some good news here. So yes, there is. I did interview organizations that are taking steps to be focused and intent on issues, and part of it is the term inclusion. Hotly debated, what is the difference between diversity and inclusion? I see an instructor that should be on your taste. Well, as I mentioned before, lack of support for not only journalists of color, but for journalists who are now trying to cover racial intense conflict. It's the newsroom's responsibility to make sure everyone in that newsroom, just like in the academic, feels welcome, heard, and respected. Newspapers and news organizations used to be very hierarchical. My editor told me, my way or the highway. That has changed. Journalism is coming from diverse newsrooms and collaborative aspects. But here's the best way to think about inclusion. You're going to a dance, getting that diversity. Being asked inclusion. Your whole process of belonging together. So you can't have inclusion. So with that, we wanted to have a little poll of the folks that are in the classroom. Because we're curious about whether you experience these things in the newsroom or the professional world you're getting to encounter. All the history lesson to prepare you. You have a loud voice, and that is being written.
And ask folks in the room, almost all, sure, how many have actually been working in newsroom as a job or internship? See, great, terrific, okay. Those of you who raise hands, can we ask you, does any of this resonate? Have any feelings of my kind of feeling? Uh-huh. Uh-huh. How did that come about? Okay, feeling kind of from the. Okay, great. For sharing that. Else? What was your else? Yeah, here. Yeah. Uh-oh. Uh-huh.
My first job out of college was Morgan State. So my first job I just got 10 years from Raleigh, and he did some reporter, and so he hired got me my first job. And the doc hired me again. 2.5 years reporter, assistant editor, so editor of the Black Page professional around the area. So learned a lot.
That's great. Yeah.
Along these lines, again, have to be responsible. So again, name, progressive, and two of the new hires were from the Middle East background, so they wore the hijab, and one editor trying to tell them apart. He was eating them mixed up, after all. So that was
organization was that? Anybody else?
In Korea, like 20 miles north of LA. District. It was an interesting experience. Most of the people, liberal, it was so editors, I was the only editor. So there were stories with sizable Latino would come up after that. Like, on one hand, it makes sense because always never do so. But significant stories that they manifest on variants. Court stories, local business owners, like stuff the gas tax, the opposition's first thing. So, like we would talk about differences and stuff, but anyway, yeah, so this is really good.
But that we hear this from business that there is this kind of sometimes if you are or whatever, the kind of pigeonholed into covering just one. You know, you and that's where, but get to cover court stories. So in your case, okay. Yeah, when
But it's not typically race, but it's not a woman. And so there was a little and then quickly show their view about women, and he came up to me and he was like, "Oh, you're a woman." About that. I just haven't done that.
awkward.
Another discussion on gender. Good report too that actually the news is we have made more progress in terms of women in positions, but again, generally white women. Honestly, tell me, I have to solve one thing. So my priority as a new editor of Metropolitan Paper was to get income equity, and it's proud of it. And I for being pragmatic. But so I will report on the gender side, more progress in terms of better position in journalism, dynamic and content.
Do we else have an experience to share? Yeah, but in the back.
National publications hiring any
Well, the general statement is that local national paper, national news organization. Another area that I'm very passionate about journalism, because there's here. What a couple of consultants, if you look at the New York Times, the Los Angeles, the Washington Post, all hiring, they're not really where this I think digital journalism, the fact that BuzzFeed has an initiative, the fact that publications are where the future is. lawyer told me I can violate because he ended up somebody else this diversity problem because we weren't trying to change the newsroom. His numbers in his newsroom. Argument that and a couple of other standing big newspapers are reaction is maybe it could be your sites is all starting to come of age where different models are being done by this organization called said there has to be one priority. We don't want the news business. So jobs come in those areas.
I'm going to add that a lot of the local news organizations, I've had 2 recent conversations with editors at top news organizations who said, we need help in one case, we just have the staff and we don't talk to Latino communities, and we help talking to the Vietnamese community. We have the staff and we don't know how to. It's still an issue. I agree with Bruce that the organizations, specialized niche. That's a opportunity right now for either be a part of something new. Excited about situation that you guys experience. I think we talked about some strategy with the possibility that you might enter. Very welcome. We've heard many times. Let me go way back. Daily newspaper immediately got us to one. Let's see. One was an Asian American contest, so I got signed to that. A visiting group from so I got into that, and then there was something all same week. And I had to go to the editor. Look, I'm happy covering these kinds of more than don't pigeon. And they kind of understood that. They thought I didn't want to cover. I don't know how. I ended up covering for the newspaper. But one thing for me in the business was getting a mentor in the newsroom. Frank, here's how the place works. Who calls the shots? Here's the one you got to be careful, right? Out the news, if you can't find one, he works for a news organization who might be able to see how things are going. So look for a mentor, or if you're in the position, a mentor for somebody else.
Well, again, on the big front, lessons shown, just hope this helps you understand in these experiences, and it's not a new phenomenon. I'll give you, I hope, the confidence to conversations, an editor. The basic tenet of a journalist is kind of out there, bring that to their attention. Institutional. If you're comfortable with emotion and you want to even be more, I noticed in my interviews the newsrooms where something finally began because an individual had gone in there and not only can cover more than just because of background, but I have been reading at state. Jobs should be posted in a wide. Maybe we ought to do that here. Suggestions how to help, is it led when they got the manager to write, we need to do this, in charge of the new diversity committee. And it's a double blessing, because they end up working harder, but they end up, in other words, you become a newspaper. We had some old meetings. I think today's newsroom open up, especially with your generation, because I think you want to be heard. So I guess I'm saying to be fearless and to bring ideas to managers that they may not have thought of.
More questions or?
You've been involved in, can you talk about what in the past you've looked for resumes, cover letters, and students who aren't privileged back, how they show you the knowledge, understand that they have language.
Well, not again, it's interesting. Different people have different hiring. I believe in because cover letters is your opportunity to say something about who you are. When you apply to college, I guess, you have to write this personal essay who you are. You know, in the cover letter, I do look. This is the reason you got into the craft. And a personal story that connected to that. Instead of who you are, you had this more of the experience. I don't look at you know, there's a get template, and the editor will scan through them and assume that the place is first. That's the one you want to see, right? You take the one first because theoretically piece and see what that has to tell me. I think of what you cover, you chose cover about, you know, passion and your. So write a good cover. Be sure you have a good variety of stories, but maybe it's something to you that reflected in your
Other questions, comments, problems?
In articles, you all know, we strive for social justice and highlight the struggles and other uncovered. Because this is pushing those what's important now to editors looking for storytelling we do. Like how do
Well, again, as you just heard from John, news organizations, all the dismal we put out here, the report was their sense that these issues are coming to the fore. 2016, that election for a lot of people in the country knew what was going on. So I think again, and expertise you're covered yours. You can take it community. To look for is how trust in that community and how you began. The last series we did at KQED was based on the fact that Oakland was becoming less black. there was a flight of African Americans out of Oakland. Well, where are they going? You know, what is education, other things that push you up? Antioch. Antioch, which was a white community 12 years ago, the most diverse communities. Bringing that up is way like I was doing, say, tell that month just going in the community, things, begin find things. So are doing for bringing to organizations, they, that alone is something you should not to let them know.
I think I'm an optimist here, but the San Francisco State experience for you as because of our emphasis on free inclusion, newsrooms that are that big issues of our time, similar to issues of the 60s, bias, abuse, Black Lives Matter, crackdown on immigrants, the crisis, which has a very much a racial aspect of that news. If you cover these stories, you can show that you have a track record to address these kinds of issues. You can talk to groups that I think that's a big stuff. I got a phone call from a newspaper editor about a month ago who he's in charge of 3 Northern California newspapers. These are the kind we need. And he wanted to create a relationship with the department. Just one point, I'm going to what I did this year about, because I firmly believe, if I can find that chart, grievance and are the conversations me covering today. If you just down this list and start these issues, you show that you are excellent candidate for journals.
Really quickly too, internship program. There are, even though they've suffered large groups, associations, you know, the American Journalists, but others are getting involved. You know, has much more active program. The which has I think provided a model 5 years ago that this cannot be, and did institutionally you need to do, which they did pipeline training and 40% non-election. So there are groups that you need to, you know, help you, they'll both support you, and you'll get.
How much time do we have?
10 minutes.
Oh.
I just want to check out things. People really know that supported 2000. I remember you are issue. But there basically about all the support. Wow, really? Is a total to media. I think that the press under attack. White House, Trump, quote, God, press coverage because it's respectful of the president. Be a guy. I mean, he really knows what he's doing. These journalists in general. I mean, the White House, political during history, was supporting federal against Trump. Journalists, working reporters, to be cognizant of what's going on. Like for its First Amendment.
Agreed. Anyone else have any questions? Here.
Last point, discussions about America as one of the top countries of discussion about is what's just maybe it can be a personal reaction about chicken pluckers. If I the story angle was some white who felt now because we're all Spanish speaking. So saying, well, yeah, it's a story about and alienation of these rural people. Is that to tell? Because all the Spanish speakers prop to the alienation white was felt. New York story being protected. And how does one tell this story that get a place? This complex Kerner Commission indicating that we is more. Those are the kind of things you'll be because it's a whole being asked to do.
Okay. So thank you, John.
Oh.
Yeah.
Not if I steer